This is part 2 of a personal behind-the-scenes conversation with me and Anngelle Wood, host of Crime of the Truest Kind, and now true friend. Anngelle had the idea for us to have an informal behind-the-scenes conversation about what happened with Open Investigation Season 1 and my research into Andy Puglisi's disappearance and the other unsolved cases of children in Massachusetts. Anngelle and I have become friends and colleagues and work together for families and loved ones of missing and murdered individuals in Massachusetts. Check it out and look for us soon for Season 2. Thanks for listening. We want to make sure you know about our new YouTube channel, Open Investigation Podcast. We'll be hosting YouTube Live. We'll also be sharing videos and archival footage. So make sure you check us out on YouTube, Open Investigation Podcast. See you soon.
Well, hello. My name is Anngelle Wood, and this is Crime of the Truest Kind. This is a true crime, local history, and storytelling podcast. My focus is advocacy, supporting victims and families of violence and crime who've suffered catastrophic loss. I advocate for those people, all of those people. I write about crimes, yes. I set the scene, connect story themes. I talk about things that happened here in Massachusetts, in New England. In this episode, we continue our conversation about what we learned after a boy went missing in the summer of 1976 in Lawrence. This episode is about murdered and missing children, about child sexual abuse, CSA, attitudes about child exploitation, systemic abuse, and we do talk about the role the Catholic Church has played in the serial abuse of children. But it doesn't stop with the Catholic Church. This systemic abuse in organizations is on the forefront of this particular subject matter. It is important for me to say, if this is a subject matter that might hurt you, impede your own healing, or possibly offend you, it may not be something you wish to listen to. And this often goes unsaid that this podcast is not for children. Please listen with care. Big thanks to newest patron Holly, you rule. I do have merch that I will share. And also, I should tell you, I'm doing a redesign for the look of the show. Thanks to all of our patrons, most especially to our superstar EP, Lisa McColgan. You also rule. Thank you for those who came out to the Kodo show in Lowell, Mass. That turned into kind of a fireside chat. We have a way of doing that. New show, Thursday, February 20th at Stoneham Public Library, Stoneham, Massachusetts. It is free. There are no tickets. I guess you just show up. The second part of my conversation with Melanie Perkins McLaughlin, who spent decades researching the disappearance of her childhood friend. His name is Andy Puglisi. He disappeared without a trace from a pool that had been filled with children. We returned to the Merrimack Valley, an area that was greatly impacted by what was happening to children, particularly in the 1970s. And we talk about why that period was so active, we'll call it, and what role Lawrence, Massachusetts had. We return to the stadium projects. Summer 1976. It's the bicentennial year. We were celebrating the country's 200th anniversary. Everything was eagles, Liberty Bells, waving flags, and commemorative coins. They even sold bicentennial wallpaper. It was both a time of celebration in America and for tremendous marketing opportunities. 10-year-old Andy Puglisi vanishes from the public pool. Here's what we know about that day and what came after. But we also have much more information about what came before. This is episode 78. I continue my conversation with Melanie Perkins McLaughlin, Andy's childhood friend who lived in the stadium projects back in the summer of 1976. Someone who decided the day Andy disappeared that she would one day set out to discover what happened to her friend, and someone we owe a debt of gratitude for the work that she has done. In researching Andy's case and making the documentary Have You Seen Andy, for uncovering the stories of so many other children like him, and from what we've learned in season 1 of her podcast, Open Investigation. First, the city's origin story. What is the history of the city of Lawrence? Do go back and listen to the 2 prior episodes I did about Andy Puglisi's case. Start with those. American merchants and philanthropists, for whom Groton's Lawrence Academy was renamed, Abbott and Amos Lawrence. They were instrumental in the development of the textile industry here. In 1845, the brothers founded the city of Lawrence as a textile town, building a complex of mills producing cotton and wool. By the early 20th century, with a soaring population, close to 95,000, its highest ever, the city was a world leader in the production of textiles in those massive mills. They purchased the 7 square miles of land on either side of the Merrimack River and called on engineer Charles S. Sturrow of the Sturrow family, for which Boston's Sturrow Drive is named. This Sturrow would design the industrial city that would rival all textile makers in the late 19th century. The city hadn't forgotten about the Pemberton Mill collapse, though. An epic disaster. On January 10, 1860, it crumbled under the weight of poor design, the weight of the workers and the machinery, the floor separated from the walls, and the floors collapsing on top of those workers. Mostly women and children, like the mill girls who came from Maine and New Hampshire, and many Irish immigrants who escaped the potato famine, a time known as the Great Hunger, where the Irish starved to death. Respect to my people, I got my DNA back, 48% Irish. Dear Heights. Hey, I'm working on it. The rubble formed a pyramid 50 feet high. The Pemberton Mill disaster was the worst industrial accident in Massachusetts history, rivaling the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in Greenwich Village in New York City some 50 years later. In October of 1910, the Air Mill opened, built to spin and dye yarn, the treasured icon of Lawrence and its contribution to the Industrial Revolution. The Air Mill Clock Tower is the largest mill clock in the world. It stands as a legendary landmark of the Merrimack Valley, an absolute crown jewel, and I hope you think about its history when you drive by now. The Air Mill operated for the next 4 decades, slowly shrinking in production as mill companies moved to the southern states with cheaper labor. By the early 20th century, and that population swelling to almost 95,000, the city of Lawrence was a world leader in the production of textiles, and a workforce that was run by those hard-working people, work that was done in oppressive conditions. Didn't they learn from the Pemberton? Lawrence had the 8th highest death rate per 100 in the country. Lowell was the worst. 36 of every 100 mill workers died by the time they were 25. Many worked in extremely damp and humid space. They were vulnerable to tuberculosis, pneumonia. Then, when their hours were cut and their pay was threatened, the workers rose up for what is now known as the Bread and Roses Strike of 1912. It was one of the most significant labor movements in U.S. history. It was a milestone for the city, for labor, and American immigration. On March 14th, the 9-week strike ended. 15,000 mill workers gathered in Lawrence Common to agree to the new terms. The Bread and Roses strike was not just a victory for Lawrence workers. By the end of March, 275,000 New England textile workers received similar raises, and other industries also followed suit. But its post-war history looks very different. The textile boom went bust in the 1950s. A once flourishing city was now struggling, with a declining population that went from over 80,000 residents in 1950 to approximately 64,000 residents by 1980. Replacing the loss of those jobs proved very difficult. Though Malden Mills, makers of polar fleece, run by the Feuerstein family for decades, They remained in Lawrence, even rebuilding, after a fire nearly destroyed the entire mill in December of 1995. Aaron Feuerstein, who took over running the mill for his family, was known as the Mensch of Malden Mills for caring for his employees while they rebuilt. Malden Mills would eventually be sold in 2007, and the company that bought it left Lawrence in 2015. And today the city celebrates their place in that history. The Bread and Roses Heritage Festival happens every year on Labor Day to recognize the labor history and the cultural diversity of the city. I really do love learning about all of this regional history. I find it very interesting. Maybe you do too. Coming up, the second part of my conversation with Melanie Perkins McLaughlin. She produced the film Have You Seen Andy?, the documentary about her search for information about her missing friend, Andy Puglisi, what that investigation uncovered, and what she continues to uncover about Andy and children just like him who went missing or were found murdered in Massachusetts in the 1970s. Support Crime of the Truest Kind. Follow us on socials at Crime of the Truest Kind. Tell your friends about the show. Share it on social media. Tell people about it in the groups that you post in. Leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Drop a tip in the jar. You will be giving all my dogs a bone, at least one. Become a patron on Patreon. 4 tiers starting at just $1. I've got new merch on the way. There is a redesign in the works. Everything online, crimeofthetruestkind.com. Thank you. By supporting the show, you help send me to AdvocacyCon that happens at the end of March in Indianapolis. It is exactly what it sounds like, a conference about advocacy in the true crime space. You brought up a very important point. When Andy went missing, it was way before we knew of little Eton Pates and Adam Walsh, some of the names that were in the news after. And that really did change how we deal with missing children.
Absolutely.
When Andy went missing, we know that there are some other implications. He was a kid in the projects. Police didn't take it. They took it far less seriously. Look at what we learned. They didn't even report it, right? They didn't even file the report for this missing boy.
No, not right away. And also, it wasn't just that. Yeah, Andy was a poor kid from the projects, and we lived in a very classist community at the time. Lawrence was the 23rd poorest city in the country and probably still is. I don't know what the rating is now, but it's still a very, very poor city. And it's also a city very much built on class, which is so ironic for so many poor people to live there and for it to be so classist, but it was. And I guess part of the reason is that when you're just a little bit higher than the lowest, then you feel like you have a little bit of capital or something like that. So for people that lived in Lawrence that maybe owned a single family home, were considered much higher on the sort of class scale than kids that lived in the projects, right? That had single moms. And again, this was the 70s, and that was a big part of it. And Andy's mother had a biracial child, right? She had 3 Caucasian children, and then she had his baby sister, Mandy, was biracial. And again, this was 1976. That was noticeable. People noticed that a lot.
Part of the investigation really did focus in on the relationship with her partner at the time, who was an African-American man. And we know that as part of many other aspects of the investigation, which we can talk to a little bit about how they handled the investigation and how short of a time they actually looked for this boy.
And, there are still people up until recently, a few detectives that have passed away, but there are still people that were on the force, on the Lawrence police force that are convinced that it was that individual, the boyfriend, right? Or that it was, a family member or that it was what have you. But, I think there could be a million theories out there, but what I want to see is evidence, right? What I want to see is, okay, well, what evidence do you have that suggests that it was the boyfriend? Okay. And, the boyfriend was in the house and, he was not seen outside. He was not seen at the pool. He had been, except for a 10-minute window when Faith went to the store, that he had been unattended, if you will. And in 10 minutes, there wouldn't have been enough time, to do anything at that point. And he was still with Faith later. So it just is not reasonable to suspect that he had an alibi. But there are things that are reasonable, right? Like the police officer who was, later found with a boy in his cruiser, and he was, allegedly molesting this boy and wearing women's clothes and, had to leave the police force quietly as a result of that in the early to mid 80s. And that was a boy from the project. Or Wayne Chapman, who was identified by multiple people as being at the pool that day, the day before, the year before, who we know had an incredible record of abusing over, 100 boys. Wayne Chapman also had a lot of camera equipment. He had a lot of high-end expensive camera equipment. So Wayne Chapman was not just abducting boys. He was producing photos, which I think he was very likely selling, because I don't know where else he would get the money for the high-end camera equipment, because he was a janitor. It was him. There was a neighbor who, we talk about, who allegedly we had gotten anonymous tips that he knew Wayne Chapman, but also there were several children in the projects who had been approached by this neighbor. And so they had shared that information. So the neighbor was known to be a pedophile. There was a lifeguard that we found out way late in the game. This was not until the podcast that we found out that there was a lifeguard, or he says he wasn't a lifeguard. He says he worked for the youth services system, but he assisted at pools. I don't know the exact details, but certainly we had someone contact us that said that children had been abused by him in pool settings, in swimming pool settings in Massachusetts, in Lawrence at the time. And so I found that too incredible to be true. I really couldn't believe it when they said that. And I thought, for sure, it had to be a different summer. It had to be a different summer. And then when they told me that the person was arrested and that there was a court record, and I went back and found the court record and the arrest record, and it was literally weeks after Andy disappeared, the same summer, this guy was arrested for sexually abusing a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old in swimming pools in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and had never, ever been questioned as far as we know. His name had never been brought up. Nothing had ever come up about this guy at all. And as it turns out, the guy knew the family, right? The guy knew the Puglisi family. So, I did have the district attorney, one of the district attorneys, say to me that the podcast was really incredible and they found it so informative. But the problem that they said they found with it was that now that felt like there are so many suspects, right? Not just, a few. And I said, yes, exactly. That's the point. There were so many, because there were so many pedophiles in the area, because there was human trafficking happening in this area, because it was a hot spot for this kind of activity.
There's an incredible piece of film in the documentary, and I know that you've used it subsequently, of Faith Puglisi saying that law enforcement told her that there were at least 5 pedophiles in the vicinity of the pool that day that Andy went missing.
The way she says it is there were 5 known child molesters at the pool that day. So back then, that's the other piece, is we didn't have this lexicon, human trafficking. We didn't have the word pedophile, right? We didn't say that. They called human trafficking of children child prostitution, as though a child can prostitute themselves. They called pedophilia child molestation or child molesting. There weren't terms for it like that, but she did say law enforcement told her there were 5 known child molesters at the pool that day. And that haunted me from the day I heard it. Like, who were these people? And so I started to try to put together a list of who were the 5 known child molesters at the pool that day. And while I don't know who exactly was at
list.
Yes, it was a much longer list.
Longer than 5, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was more than 5. I think we're up to like 13 now at this point. It's crazy. But, again, within a half-mile radius, put it that way. If they weren't at the pool that day, they were within a quarter-mile, half-mile radius from, a Little League coach to a bus driver to a lifeguard to a, neighbor to a cop to a priest to it just went on and on. It was crazy. And it's like, is this typical? Like, are there Are there that many pedophiles concentrated in one area? I don't know, but there certainly were at that time.
There was no registry.
There was no registry.
And a lot of these people didn't have any kind of criminal record at that time.
Or if they did, in some cases, it could be covered up, like a police officer or a priest. They wouldn't arrest people like that for this behavior. As we know all too well from Boston Globe Spotlight, right? Like they would just sort of ignore it, let them go on and sort of hope it went away and not talk about it. But yes, that's very important to note that there was not a sex offender registry at the time, which, how do you think a sex offender registry came about, Anngelle?
It was after children went missing and it was discovered there were people around there.
It was, yes. I forget exactly the law. It was,
Wasn't it Johnny Ghosh?
It wasn't Johnny Gosh. It might have been
Gosh?
Jacob Wetterling. Was it Jacob Wetterling? I can't remember which of the cases it was, but the point is, it was a child who went missing, who was a high-profile case, whose parents and whose loved ones advocated for legislation to change the system, and that's how sex offender registry came about.
That's how the Amber Alert is an Amber Alert.
Exactly, and that's why the Amber Alert is the Amber Alert, because these cases, and that's why we have the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and that's why we have child pornography laws. I mean, literally, if you listen to the podcast, the reason the child pornography laws were created in 1978 is because there was so much effing child pornography. And then people are like, oh, I don't know if this was really true. It's like, listen to the, or look at the transcripts of the congressional hearings. It was true. It was true. And that's why the law was created. But, and that's how and why laws are created, and that's why we encourage families and loved ones and people who care about this cause to advocate.
And it's been something that really the general public still now, even after all of these years and after all of this information and after all of this evidence, quite frankly, that has been presented, the general public still doesn't want to think about these kinds of things. Is it possible that people were stealing children off the street and putting them into sex trafficking? Yes.
And not just into sex trafficking, into being unwilling participants in a child sex abuse image industry. And so, yes, being abused, but also for photographs. And there was a lot of money to be made. There was a lot of money that was being made. But I just wanted to fact check the sex offender registry was actually part of the Amber Alert. So in 1996, President Bill Clinton signed the Amber Hagerman Child Protection Act law into law, creating the Amber Alert system and the National Sex Offender Registry. You can read more about Amber Hagerman if you want, if you Google her.
Whose murder is still unsolved.
It's still unsolved. And thank her and her family for all of the hard work they did to create the Amber Alert. It's probably saved thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, and the sex offender registry. So yeah, it's children and the legacy of these children that change systems.
We simply as a society couldn't function without things like this. And we still need so much more. There's so much more legislation that we need. You summed up a couple of those things, but there's so much more that still needs to be put in place.
I mean, just the statute of limitations,
Yes.
The fact that there's a statute of limitations on child rape, that should not be the case. And that a lot of folks, don't even start to deal with their trauma till they're in their 50s, which is incredible. The statute of limitations has likely passed at that point. And now in Massachusetts, it's 53. It was changed in 2015. But we're trying to eliminate the statute of limitations altogether because there shouldn't be a limit on individual trauma. And especially if there's corroborating evidence, if people, if there's other people come forward that have been abused by the same person, there's lots of ways to determine whether the stories or how the stories are accurate. So there's that. There's a lot of different, there's a lot of trouble in schools, a lot of child abuse in schools, and there's no regulation in schools. Schools do the same things that the Catholic Church was able to do. They let people go quietly. If there's an allegation, they generally can just offer them to leave their position, and the person can go down the street and get a job at another school and not necessarily have anything in their record, especially if there wasn't a criminal conviction. So there's lots and lots of work to be done. And also, even with the material that had been created, there's people who are actively advocating against the sex offender registry, right? So there's the defense counsel for a lot of registered sex offenders who try to claim double jeopardy or that this is, unfairly labeling people or any number of things. So, and they stay active. How does
that go over in the court of law?
Well, it's interesting because Massachusetts is generally pretty lenient on defense attorneys. So I would hate to see the day that that would ever happen. And I would hope that there would be people out there who would advocate against, a sex offender registry being taken away. I would certainly think that there would be. But, the people who are on the other side of that argument don't rest. They continue to advocate. So that's why it's so important to have families and loved ones and people who care about these stories advocating. So if you're listening and you're interested in advocacy in Massachusetts to prevent child sex abuse and to help support families of missing and murdered loved ones, please reach out to us and let us know, because we're working on getting that rolling and really offering some resources for that.
Having the experience of meeting family members, speaking to family members who have a missing loved one, who have a murdered loved one, an unsolved case, hearing the stories about how this happened to them and they had absolutely no idea what to do, where to go, who to talk to. They go to law enforcement. Law enforcement has said, they're not missing. They're not missing, which is not that different from Andy's case. Let's face it. He was a child, and you can tell me exactly how this happened for you when you were researching it, but he went missing. His mother could not find him. His mother went around asking, have you seen Andy? Have you seen Andy? No one saw him. And then she tried to report him, which eventually they showed up. They didn't file it. And for only 6 days, they looked for a missing child. And there are all kinds of excuses and theories that came into play, one of which became, after speaking with you about this, I learned that law enforcement started to say, well, he's really not missing.
Yeah, there was Faith talks about having been approached by law enforcement a couple of days into the search. They wanted to call the search off. Police chief was Chief Hart at the time, and I believe he was the person who had approached the Puglisi family. And they approached with the idea that they would call the search off, not because they didn't think he was missing, but because whoever was holding him might have been intimidated by all of this search activity, and that this would help them get their defenses down, let the person who might be holding Andy sort of put their defenses down and be less likely to be so sensitive to the issue and what have you. So Faith agreed to letting the search be called off. She says she would have never called the search off had it not been for that. And, 6 days is not a long time to look for a 10-year-old missing boy. And at the same time, in some ways, it felt like forever. It was a slow start. And then once it started, it felt like the entire world was descending on us. There were helicopters everywhere and National Guards everywhere. And they had set up of all things, a CB trucker station, which was the search headquarters, which we find out later, as you hear in the podcast, that amateur radio and CB radio was really one of the ways that pedophiles communicated with each other back in the day, because they didn't have the internet. So they would use that.
It was the pedo Twitter of the day.
It was, actually, to be honest. It was a major way that they communicated. Who knew that? And truck driving. And so, the truck driving could transport children across state lines, right? So, and a lot of the truck drivers were the ones who were running the CB radios, right? Like, if you remember, that was sort of, think about this in the 70s and 80s, 10-4, big trucker, I forget what it was.
10-4, Big Daddy?
Yeah, something. I forget. But everybody had like a handle,
just
like
nickname, yeah.
You had a handle like you do on Twitter. I mean, you had everybody, people had a handle. And, right before Andy went missing, he got a really nice CB radio for his birthday. And it wasn't an amateur. I mean, it wasn't it wasn't like a little plastic Fisher Price toy thing. It was a heavy duty. I remember putting the
real thing.
It was the real deal. I remember putting the walkie-talkie in my hand and being like, this is the real deal. It was like a heavy one. It was like a police radio,
Mm-hmm.
It felt really real. And I just, one of the very few memories I have of me and Andy is playing with that. And it was just such a funny scene because we just walked out of each other's sight. We weren't, we literally went around the corner so we couldn't see each other, but we would use the radio to communicate. And you could hear our voices in the air, never mind over the radio. So like, it was kind of funny. It was a child's way of, out of sight, out of mind. So you think that like you can't see each other. So the CB radios were, sort of effective, but it was kind of this cute scene where we just were like probably, 10 or 20 feet away from each other, but blocked from each other's sight while we were using this very nice CB radio set that he had gotten just before he disappeared. And
do you remember who gave that to him?
You know what? It just occurred to me to add, as you were saying that, I was just like, who gave that CB radio set to Andy?
I mean, it raises my red flags. Is this something that may have contributed to his disappearance?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because, Wayne Chapman talks about having taken the boy from the pool with a much younger child and the boy talking about CB radios. So that was another sort of piece of information that was interesting with Chapman. But, it's so funny. These are the things that happen, Anngelle, in the course of this decades of stories that you get so caught up in the facts and all of the information or whatever. And then just as I was telling you that story, I literally was thinking in my brain, gee, I never asked who gave him the CB radio, right? And not that, it could be completely inconsequential.
Not going to crack the case.
No.
It's an important thing to maybe try to find out.
It's an interesting question, right? It's an interesting question. And again, it wasn't as relevant for a long time because I didn't know until probably the last couple of years that CB radio was the way that, pedophiles communicated. I didn't know anything about the trafficking and use of amateur radio and CB radio really until I was reading Ann Burgess's work and also, interviewing her for the podcast where she confirmed and talked about that was a way that they communicated, but also, that truck drivers would transport the children. That was a big way of transporting children. And again, her research comes from the 70s and 80s. She was out of Boston University, a forensic nurse, and again, is featured in Mindhunter, I believe, for Netflix as the forensic nurse. And she did a lot of research back in the day on these cases and quite remarkable in the work that she's done and the way that she studied this, and actually wrote a book called Child Pornography and Sex Rings from the 1970s and 1980s, which, I love to bring that book with me as like a hard copy book when I go to share a presentation with law enforcement. Just put it on the desk. And I say, when people try to tell me that, no, this wasn't real, just having this tangible book and say, really, because here's a book written about it. Here's a book from, an esteemed professor at Boston University that tells the whole, a lot of the history, not the entire history, but a lot of the history of the trafficking of these children. And again, they didn't call it trafficking. They called it child prostitution. So even the ring that was broken up in Revere in 1977, they called these kids child prostitutes.
And once again, the victims of crime get essentially blamed for their
especially
own abuse.
100%, especially if they're poor kids without a lot of social capital whose parents can't defend them while they're being blamed. So these kids were being enticed with, pizza and beer and maybe some small change and money to come to this apartment. And guys would ask them, they would have to perform sex acts or, be raped essentially by adult men and maybe have some pictures taken and everything, but hey, they got some pizza out of it, right? So that must mean that they, wanted to do this. This is so vile and so wrong. But the interesting thing is I've talked to adult survivors of these crimes who, particularly men, who I'm sure very much still struggle with the experience. And I will have men who say to me, I knew what I was doing at the time. And I will say, you were 13 or you were 15. And they'll say, yeah, but I knew what I was doing at the time. And you're under the age of consent. You might think that you consented, but you legally were unable to consent. And psychologically, you were unable to consent.
And we know that along the lines of their interaction with law enforcement and other, entities, that they were told that.
Yes.
You agreed to it. So they're actually, a lot of these children, now adults, are programmed to believe that. Well, you were there and you kept going. The same thing we see in sex abuse cases or sexual assault. Well, you went back.
Yeah. It's just wrong. And so again, thank you for saying that, because if there are survivors out there that are listening that experience this sort of trauma, we want to let you know that you're not alone. It was not your fault. We believe you. And the age of consent was 16. And actually, not even at the time, I don't think. Yeah, they did have the age of consent at 16. And NAMBLA was trying to lower it to 13, and the law would not allow it because 13-year-olds cannot consent, 14-year-olds cannot consent, 15-year-olds cannot consent. And even, I think back to I was thinking about this the other day because I was thinking about myself as a 15-year-old, and boy, did I think I knew everything, right? I literally thought I knew everything. I was maybe a freshman in high school, a sophomore in high school, and I thought I knew it all. I knew what it meant. I knew what all this stuff, sex and, physical intimacy, whatever meant. I wasn't active at that point, but I thought I knew it all. And it was I had no idea, I had no idea. And, even at 18, I remember thinking, what else is there to know? I literally was like, I think I'm good. I pretty much.
Were you the, what do you want to know? I'll tell you.
Totally.
There was always that person around that was like,
that was me.
You were young and having the sex talk, somebody that professed to know everything. They clearly didn't, but.
Well, I mean, I didn't necessarily in that realm because I hadn't been active earlier in life. But, 16, 17, 18, but I did seek out friends that did, that's for sure. And when I got the skinny, then I would let other people know, that's for sure. But I did. I always, and I say this now, and it's I say it with all the humility that I, for a very long time, unfortunately thought everyone was entitled to my opinion. Yeah. So that took years of work to be able to understand that, what, I don't know everything and everyone's not entitled to my opinion. But that's why facts are so important, right? That's why having hard facts and data is important. And so when we're telling stories like this, to be able to say, well, here's the data. And like, in the film, and have you seen Andy, I never say in that film what I think happened. I never say for people, this is what I think happened. I do in the podcast, because so much time has passed at this point, and I feel like I have decades and decades of research to say, oh, I know Andy was used for human trafficking. I believe he was taken for that. I believe he was likely being scouted before he was taken.
And that's what the CB radio red flag comes up for me.
And the Polaroid.
Yeah.
Remember the Polaroid that he gave to his mother, a couple of weeks before he disappeared? And when she said, where did you get this? I mean, Polaroid film was expensive back then. It was fairly new technology, and it was expensive. And, she asked Andy where he got this picture. He had given her a Polaroid, and he said, some man had asked him to take his picture, and she said, don't ever let anyone take your picture. And we've come to find out through the podcast that there were actually individuals in the projects taking Polaroid pictures of children and selling them for child sex abuse material.
And subsequently, that put him, it may have happened prior to that, it may have happened after that, but that put him, unfortunately, on a radar. Yep.
And I believe that people, and it's not just my belief, but it's, scientific evidence that pedophiles have a type, or a certain type sells better. And, there's all this misinformation out there that they would say Wayne Chapman's type was blonde-haired, blue-eyed children. And it's so interesting because if you look at his victims, none of them were blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Right. None of them were. They were dark-haired and dark-eyed. And in some of the cases of some of the children, they look so similar, some of the cases of the children that went missing. Like, I see resemblance with Michael O'Gorman and Andy Puglisi. Michael O'Gorman disappeared in the 70s, and his body was subsequently found. Or even Lee Savoy, I see similarities in their coloring, in their brown eyes, their wavy hair, just sort of things like that.
Lee Savoy is another child that has been blamed for their own disappearance.
Not by me.
No,
certainly not by me.
You. Not by you.
Lee Savoy was a little boy who went missing from Revere, Massachusetts, where there were certainly 5 known pedophiles within a quarter-mile radius of, when Lee went missing. We know that for sure. And, he was also only 10 years old. He was very independent, and he was shining shoes that day outside of Suffolk Downs. And
it was a very different time. We were all feral children.
It's true. We would be gone all day long. Mm-hmm. Could be gone all day long, and people wouldn't even ask where you were. You came home at dinner, and that was pretty much it. And we had no phones. We didn't tell people we're going. We had bikes where you could go miles away from where you actually were. So yeah, it's true. We were just all out on our own, which again leads me to believe. I know the data says that the 70s is the highest number of missing children of any decade. Unsurprising, because there was not a lot of laws in place, but I also think it was because it was the onset of a booming industry.
They started to realize how lucrative that this sort of thing could be, so much so that they wanted to basically, make it an organization.
Yeah, they had to monetize it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had to monetize it.
So you did all of the decades and decades of research that you created the documentary, Have You Seen Andy? Several years passed, and you released Open Investigation, 8 episodes that came out in just this past fall.
It's technically 9, by the way. because we have an episode 0. It's actually 9
That's right.
episodes.
That's right. I forget the 0 thing always throws
I
me
know,
off.
I know. It was a weird little
9
pilot thing.
episodes. So that was one plan. And as we know, the research never ends. And that leads you to what will be season 2, which is coming very soon.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about where you're going next.
Yeah. So, first of all, it was the first podcast I have done, which I cannot thank you enough, Anngelle Wood of Crime of the Truest Kind, for really just putting my feet to the fire and making me do it. We met, I didn't realize it was Andy's birthday the day that we met. You said we met for coffee in a coffee shop a year or so before the podcast actually came out. I had been working on the podcast on and off for years.
I'd been looking for it once I learned about the documentary and went to the website, and I saw you talking about how we're working on a podcast. And this was, I don't know how many
2017
years.
is when we started working on the podcast, started the idea.
Yeah.
And again, if you listen to the podcast, something happened that made me decide, okay, I need to go back in and podcast was a fairly new genre at that point, and it was less expensive than creating a full-scale documentary. So I decided I would try this route, but I had no real experience with it. And so what I did was I listened to a lot of podcasts, and I listened to podcasts that I liked and podcasts that I didn't like. And I really thought about what made me like what I liked and what made me not like what I didn't like. I'm very much a storyteller, obviously, as a documentary filmmaker. So I wanted real stories from real people. I know how much music matters and how evocative, being able to tell a story with music matters. So I was so grateful that we got Drew O'Doherty to score the podcast and, got editing help from Mike Joshua. And again, recommendations from you, Anngelle, and just really, I kept saying, I was so stuck on the RSS feed. I'm like, what's the RSS feed? And like the technical piece of it. And it was just like, you know what? Just, do it. And, you helped me with some of the technical, and now it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. And then once it's done, you're like, oh, that wasn't so bad. I can do it again. And, although there were parts of it that were pretty bad. I mean, staying up till midnight on some nights, getting the show out, the next morning because something had gone awry, or, just because it was the nature of doing what we were doing. And I also really have to throw myself into this story in a way that, Andy's family, Andy's mother and father and brothers and sisters have had to live with their brother missing at the table, missing at life events for their entire lives. Every day they are dealing with his disappearance, and they are victims and survivors in this case.
Mm-hmm. Our friend Julie Murray calls it ambiguous loss.
Amen. It's such ambiguous loss. And I love when Julie says that because she articulates it so well. And sometimes just giving words to something matters, right? Like human trafficking and, and naming it really matters. So that ambiguous loss is real. And I think for a long time, I didn't identify myself as a victim of Andy's disappearance because I was so focused on the truth telling and the getting the story out and amplifying the voices so that, more people knew about this injustice that had happened to this little boy and all these other children across the country, that I had really forgotten about that 9-year-old girl that was there that day. And I don't think I really honored that experience for her or for me in a way that needed to be honored. And I have been sober for 20 years, and I actively attend a 12-step program, and I learned a lot about myself through that program. And I also, about, 8 years ago, maybe, or so, probably coinciding around the time that I started the podcast, or, a few years maybe before, I started actively doing trauma therapy. And so I had a therapist on and off throughout my life. I had, a very complex childhood and a lot of trauma as a child, but I never had a name for it. I did not call it trauma. In fact, when my trauma therapist, who was just a therapist but had a doctorate, got a doctorate in trauma, and I didn't know that when I got this therapist, it just, the universe collided and I ended up with this fantastic therapist who had a doctorate in trauma unbeknownst to me. But I remember the first time she called what I had experienced as a child trauma. I was like, oh, I think you're being a little dramatic, aren't you? Like, really? Trauma? I mean, I had a tough childhood, but come on. And I didn't name it, and I had dismissed that, and sort of, and not just Andy's abduction. A lot of things happened. I went into foster care, a lot of other things. I lived in a home where there was a lot of abuse and neglect, but I didn't name it because I didn't know that it had a name. And the name is trauma, and it's complex childhood trauma, CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder from complex childhood trauma, which means sustained trauma over a long period of time, specifically developmentally, when you're developing as a child. So I didn't know any of that. And I learned it all, and by no means all, because, right, I'll go back to that. I don't know it all at this point. The older I get, the more I realize, the less I know. But I learned about trauma through this trauma therapist. And I read this fantastic book in the sense that it named it, and it showed brain scans of people who had been traumatized as children and what their brains look like today, and how, we have a higher level of cortisol in our bloodstream, and how we don't process information the same way because, when we're triggered by that cortisol, our hippocampus stops. I don't know the exact words in terms of the brain, so don't hold me literally here, but basically, I could be triggered in a situation and I might not be able to function where I, might be trying to call a phone number or pay a bill or something like that. And I'm triggered and I can't remember that basic stuff. And I get frustrated and I'll be like, why can I not remember this number right now? Or why cannot I not, whatever, open this can of soup or something very basic right now. And it's like, because I'm triggered at a higher level and I'm in a fight, flight, or flee or fawn or whatever mode, where my body is just trying to survive and doesn't know that it's not in danger anymore because I had, lived this way for so long as a child. I also didn't know that when I would share these stories of childhood trauma, when I would tell somebody about Andy's story, in fact, when I was telling you about Andy's story and the history of my relationship with Andy and friendship with Andy in our childhood, I remember I was shivering and I said to you, I know I'm shivering right now. It was cold too, but I was also like, part of the reason you shiver when you tell these trauma stories is because your blood flow is going to your main organs so that it's thinking a lion's chasing you and you have to fight. And so, your extremities will get cold and you might shiver. And people didn't know, this biologically, back in the 70s. But since so much trauma research has happened since then, they do. And for me, that data and that information was tremendously important. And I wanted to share that information with survivors as well, because survivors are trauma survivors, and understanding one's trauma helps us to learn, A, that we're not alone, and B, that what's happening to us physiologically is not our fault. Like, it's not, you can't remember something because something's wrong with your memory. You can't remember something right now because you're triggered, right? You're in a trauma mode. And so what do you do when you're in that trauma mode? Well, you ground yourself, right? You do things where you might feel your feet on the ground, or chew some ice, or, just make yourself sort of be present in the moment, which is why mindfulness is so important, right? So I learned all about trauma through, trauma therapy, years of trauma therapy, and this book, The Body Keeps the Score. And then also Judy Herman's book, who's featured in our podcast, Open Investigation. Judy Herman wrote a book called Truth and Repair. And Judy is considered the mother of trauma research, which essentially happened in the 90s, where, they really identified that trauma is not just for war veterans, that it exists in, with everybody. And what that looks like, again, in brain slices, right? Brain scans, how that affects us physiologically, all of those things. And so she wrote a book recently, in her 80s, actually, called Truth and Repair. And I remember reading chapter 5 of that book, and I was so blown away because it was like reading about my life. And, the reason, again, trauma survivors might be overachievers, or just all of these other things that I didn't know, but also the way in which truth-telling and advocacy helps repair trauma. And I was like, oh my God, like my whole life I've been doing this truth-telling and advocacy and not knowing that that was me healing myself and not realizing that that's what I was doing. And so, kudos to that 9-year-old little girl who knew a hell of a lot more than, the adult Melanie, I think, when, I was standing outside that tree that day, knew that what happened to Andy was such an injustice, and that when I grew up, I was going to try to find him, and that little girl went through a lot and, continues to go through a lot by telling this truth and telling these stories. But now I know that it's, helps with the healing. It helps with empowerment. Empowering other families is incredibly meaningful to me, and empowering other victims is incredibly meaningful to me. And, one of the podcast got downloaded 80,000 times. I mean, for your first podcast, I thought that was pretty fucking amazing. I was like, really? I was so happy. And part of the reason that I was, that happened too was because, another podcast or another woman featured the story. She'd done a story on Andy years ago, and then she featured the podcast right before it came out. And it was women helping women, which I love in this business, in this industry. And it's so important, like you, Anngelle, helping me and, doing this story as well. And, it's so meaningful. And it's funny because when I listened to your podcast about Andy's story the first time, and you're like, oh, I reached out to Melanie, but I didn't hear back, that happens or whatever. And I was like, oh my God, I was so mortified because first of all, your podcast on Andy was so good. And it was so many people get the facts wrong and you didn't. And I really appreciated that, which is why I reached out to you, because I was like, wow, thank you for telling the story.
And there are things that I left out because I didn't quite, talking to you, I know that was another piece of it that I could very well have included, but I didn't quite. There are things about the Georgetown case that I removed. Yeah. Because it didn't quite all line up for me.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people don't even know the association because it was never mentioned, when it came out in the news about, the Georgetown witness and victim X or whatever, that it was no indication that the way that, he had come to police was, sort of shortly after watching the, documentary.
And I'm not being secretive about that. You talk about that.
I do in the podcast. I do. And so, but to that end is, I guess what I was saying is that, women helping women, but the downloads are so important to let people know that it does matter and people are listening. So thank you, to folks out there who downloaded the show, who are following the show, who are subscribed to look at season 2, listen to season 2. We so appreciate you doing it. And we know it's a hard listen, but it's an important listen. And so there's been, hundreds of reviews as well. And the podcast has gotten hundreds of 5-star reviews. And when I was making the podcast and I was really in the middle of the trauma, right? Like to do this, you have to, especially if you're a victim, right? Like it's one thing if you're a person telling the story from the outside and you didn't really live it. Like I can tell the other children's stories, other than Andy, and with a little bit of a distance of a perspective, right? Because I wasn't involved in that particular story the way that I had been with Andy's. But with Andy's, I am a victim of his disappearance, and it has affected me for my life, and it will affect me for my life. And I know that now, and that's okay. Like it's okay in the sense that I can acknowledge that, and I don't need somebody else to tell me that. I know why I do what I do, and why it's important to me, and why I'll continue to do what I do. And so season 2, part of what I found with Andy's story is that there's a whole other character in the story, right? One of the people, when I was making the documentaries, one of my mentors said, oh, the pool needs to be a character in the story. And I was like, right, like the pool is a character in the story, in the documentary. And Lawrence is a character in the story. And Lawrence is a big character. And people, it's very hard to understand Lawrence and the community and the culture not having experienced it. However, there are Lawrence, Massachusetts city-like places all over the country. It's an urban mill city, extreme poverty, lots of immigrants, lots of corruption.
For a period of time, it was really up and coming for all of the textile production that was coming out of Lawrence. And things shifted as they did when we hit the Great Depression, et cetera.
Yeah, when the mills closed, it turned things around a lot for it. And I didn't know why there was so much Irish in Lawrence. And I was surprised to find out that like when they couldn't find work here, they would walk the 30 miles to the textile mills, and there's a lot of great Lawrence History Center's great. And the Bread and Roses, there's a lot of fantastic history in Lawrence. So I don't want anybody out there to be like Lawrence bashing. I do have a sign literally in my office that says you can take the girl out of Lawrence, but you can't take the Lawrence out of the girl. And it's true. We can talk about our city, but anybody else talk about our city, and we'll those are fighting words.
Well, we're massholes, so we'll.
Right.
I wear it as a badge of honor.
Exactly.
I wear my massholeness as a badge of honor.
Exactly.
And it's like we're kind of in on the joke, and sorry,
right.
people from elsewhere. It's like, we'll let you in on it eventually, maybe.
Right. Right. And I'm proud to be from Lawrence. The systems weren't good to me as a kid. And it was, I tell people it was part, I hope if you've seen the films, you'll know, but I say it was part Stand By Me, part Lord of the Flies, right? So Stand By Me is the story of these kids that sort of stick together through this trauma. And Lord of the Flies are these kids who kill each other through this trauma. And so it was those extremes. Literally, it was a tough place. And, it was a tough place for kids from the projects. And it was a tough place for kids that didn't have an adult who could stand up for them. There were a lot of us. And I 100% believe that there are hundreds of victims that experienced child sex trafficking in Lawrence in the 1970s, in the Merrimack Valley in the 1970s. And the Merrimack Valley includes, Haverhill, Lawrence, Lowell, Methuen, I think, but it wasn't technically on the Wikipedia, which I was like, what? Like, how could that be? But of course, Methuen is like almost Lawrence, really. And, some of the southern New Hampshire cities as well, they say is Merrimack Valley. But essentially, I felt like Andy and kids like Andy were targeted. We were targeted by people who were of higher means, who had more than we did, and exploited us for their benefit because they knew they could, because they knew they had power, and we as children, and more so as marginalized, underrepresented children, did not have power. And I want to reclaim some of that power. And I am hoping that in season 2, we will be able to share and uncover the stories of children who survived some of this trafficking and some of this abuse. And so the way in which I choose to do that for season 2 is I am focusing on the 15 plus Catholic priests who were in the Merrimack Valley at the time in the 1970s who were credibly accused of abusing children. So I wanted to show systemic abuse, and I think that I showed that in season 1 in Open Investigation. But this is sort of just a deeper dive into some of the systemic abuse of children in the Merrimack Valley through the clergy abuse stories and what was happening. And it's interesting because I think I've talked to some people about this, and they think that they know this story, and they don't know this story. They know what they've read in newspapers, perhaps, and they know, what they've seen on the Academy Award-winning Spotlight film and in the Pulitzer Prize-winning Boston Globe Spotlight series.
I do have to take a moment to say this, though. Kristen Lombardi in the Boston Phoenix reported on that before.
Amen. Kristen Lombardi and the Boston Phoenix uncovered that story. And how many people know Kristen Lombardi's name, right? And
I've tried to reach out to Kristen Lombardi.
Me too.
And I understand why she probably wouldn't want to talk about it with me.
I've tried to reach out to her as well. And so, Kristen, if you're out there and you're listening, we'd love to, elevate you and, tell your story, because we think you're amazing, and, having gotten the story out there and really making a difference in thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of children's lives. So thank you for that.
Because the Boston Globe had so many more resources, they were able to attack it in a different way.
That's right. That's a huge part of why, it takes so long sometimes to make podcasts or to do the things that it's been, decades of me doing this work, because I'm not an organization or an entity that has a lot of resources, but I keep on doing it because it's important. Getting back to the way that people think that they know this story, I think that they know that, there was clergy abuse, and know that I don't know that they understand the systemic nature of it. I also don't know that they understand what actually happened to children. And when I think, people like maybe listening and thinking, well, why do I want to hear that? Which people have said about Open Investigation as well. Like, well, why would I want to hear, these stories? And I think that if you read the reviews, you'll see why you want to hear the stories.
You have to listen because it's real life. I mean, people watched The Keepers, and that was really, really uncomfortable. In addition to so many other things, for those people who aren't aware of the Keepers, it's a case of a murdered nun in Baltimore in the 60s.
Late 60s.
Again, I don't know.
Yeah,
late
Baltimore,
60s.
Maryland, late 60s.
She was murdered
Catholic school, Keogh school.
Because children were being abused in the school, and it's believed she knew something, and people wanted to keep her quiet.
Well, and they demonstrate how, there were certainly priests involved in the abuse of the children at this Catholic school.
Mm-hmm.
But, the Keepers was a huge inspiration to me for the podcast. And, it was, and I say this in the podcast, the Keepers and, who took Johnny Gosh and Jacob Wetterling and all of it. It's like, they have all been in Bear Brook, and they've all been inspiration to me to tell the truth about, what happened, and as much of the truth as I can find in terms of people willing to tell the stories and, come forward. If there are people listening that have experienced abuse in the Merrimack Valley, I do want to hear from you. I do think it's important. And even if you're not ready to share your story on the record, it's important just to understand the scope and scale of what was going on at the time, and also to understand any of the organized nature of it. So I appreciate anybody willing to reach out. openinvestigationpod@gmail.com. I'm sure, Anngelle will put this in the notes and stuff as well. But so what I really want to focus on is the survivors, but I'm going to be profiling the priest. And so I want to characterize these priests, because too often I think people see them as, it was one priest. It was just this one bad apple priest, and what have you. And it's like, I actually want to get into who were these priests? What were they doing? What were they about? And why did they do, what they did? And not that there's any excuse for any of the things that they did, but there's generational trauma as well. And there's a lot of, I know with Ronald Paquin, he talked about having been abused by a priest when he was a child. And so how was that perpetrated? And also sort of looking at the grooming process and the hidden nature of this story, in the ways that boys in particular, because Lawrence is such a strong city in terms of resilience and being tough, right? We always, consider ourselves tough as kids. And so boys in particular had to be tougher than girls. And so that toughness made them much more unlikely to tell what was happening to them sexually as kids. And I think that there is hundreds, if not thousands, of survivors out there who haven't heard this story, who haven't told their stories, because they think that they're the only one. And I don't want them to think that they're the only one anymore.
And the shame of it.
Right.
The shame of it needs to be placed on the people who did this.
That's right. That's right. And I love that. I love the way that Giselle Pellicot, who is the hero in France, who came forward and wanted to publicize her story, because she said the responsibility needs to be placed on the abusers, not the victim.
That's right.
And she was so brave, and really, I think, should have been the Time Person of the Year. And I just admire the woman so much. And if, Giselle Pellicot, who has been through so much, was willing to come forward and go public nationally and internationally, what a brave soul. And the people that were on my podcast, Open Investigation, were incredibly brave souls for sharing what they did. And I think if you talk to any of them today, they would say that it helped them, and it continues to help them. In fact, they're active in advocacy and legislative advocacy. I think that we also try to be very trauma informed when we're doing interviews. I'm not trying to, I do pre-interviews before I do any interviews, but I also make sure that, there's support systems in place for the person, that, they have other people that they can talk to, that we stop if they want to stop, that we don't use information that if they don't want it to be used, that they have power over their story, that they have agency over their story. But most importantly, I want to make sure that people in the Merrimack Valley, that survivors in the Merrimack Valley, and I know you're out there, know that we believe you, that you're not alone, that it's not your fault, and that you can make a difference. If you're not ready to share your story, that's okay too. You don't have to. When you're ready, there are people who are ready to listen, and there are people who are ready to help you. If you are ready and you want to share, we're here. If you're not sure if you're ready and you want to share, we're here. But really, it's about naming trauma and calling it out and telling truth and speaking truth to power, and hoping that by speaking that truth, it changes systems.
Most definitely, because you have people that have been living with these secrets, these people who have been keeping these secrets for years and years and years, and they shove them down and shove them down. And as you said it, the body does tell the score, doesn't it? Because
it's going to come out one way or the other.
We
Yeah.
have folks that have, addiction issues
Yep.
and just traumatic responses to things in their own lives,
Mm-hmm.
who haven't been able to deal with these things for all of these reasons and more, who once they have an opportunity to try to just even talk about that, there's a relief that comes.
Right. And I love what Billy Giblin says, in our final episode when we're talking about advocacy as well, though. And he talks about how it's so important to have a support system in place before you start to tell your story, because if you don't, it can be even more detrimental, right? Because all of these things can, especially if you don't have there's a lot of substance abuse in these situations, because people think it quiets the sort of memories, it quiets the whatever, but eventually it doesn't, right? Eventually they come up anyway. And, like I said, I'm in a 12-step program, and in that program, there's a saying, we're only as sick as our secrets. And, being able to, I think, affect change by telling your story and learning that you're not alone, and understanding that there are support groups like, SNAP, which is a local support group. There's Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. And we'll talk to some of the SNAP folks. Like, I'm not just going to throw all this stuff out there at people. There will be resources for dealing with trauma. There'll be supports around that. And there'll be some understanding of what happens in these situations with trauma. But there'll also be, what can be done today, because there's still a lot that happened that people weren't held accountable for. Like in Louisiana, they're trying, there's a lot, Louisiana was one of the oldest archdioceses in the country, long history of abuse, not unlike Boston. A lot of clergy abuse across the country. This is not unique to Massachusetts, right? This is not unique to the United States. This is around the world. Right. And sort of what still needs to be changed, like, again, the statute of limitations, right? And opening a window, even if they don't eliminate the statute, you can open a window where they did that in New York, where people could come forward for a year and be able to make a claim. And unfortunately, what a lot of organizations are doing now is they're claiming bankruptcy to avoid, responsibility. And for a criminal case, I think it's only, or for some of the cases for the nonprofit itself, it's only $20,000 that you can get. There's a law that they're trying to eliminate around a nonprofit law. And so, there's just a whole bunch of things that need to be changed with this very, very broken system, and they can be changed. But the way that we change them is through storytelling and truth-telling of real people with real experience who can and want to change systems for the next generation of children, because it has to stop somewhere.
Yes. And I would love to say that these are problems that are going away, but they're really not, because we see it in school systems. It's not just the Catholic Church. I mean, we see it in religious organizations. We sure as hell see it in cults, right?
Schools, Boy Scouts, anywhere there are children, so that's why there's child abuse prevention at a larger level that needs to be addressed. And yeah, I mean, I'll never be wanting for work, working in this field. I know that I'm not going to cure, child sex abuse, but I think I can help some people along the way. And I know that I'm, certainly helping myself with being able to share these stories and affect change. And, in the reviews, one of the reviews that, stays with me often is this one where a person wrote in and said, I knew what had happened to me as a child. I didn't have a name for it. I didn't know what it was called. And now I know it was CSA, the acronym for child sex abuse. And I'm going to begin to do something about it. And I thought, yeah, that's it. Name it. Call it out. Name it. Tell it what it is. And then do something about it. And that's really why I'm doing this. For the season 2, it's about Merrimack Valley. It's about the kids. It's about, as kids, we were told we were to be seen and not heard. And not having that anymore. We're going to be heard.
You're supposed to put up with it. You were just supposed to just let it happen and just go about your day.
Right. And forget about it. You're grown up now. It doesn't matter, but really, then how come I have a hard time getting up for work? Or how come I can't stop drinking? Or how come I can't stop doing drugs? Or how come I can't have an intimate relationship? Or how come I can't,
I'm filled with anxiety.
Right. Yeah. I'm filled with anxiety. How come I sweat every time I walk by a church? You know what I mean? Like, it's all of those things. It's like, okay.
I drive by, there's this one particular church that I've driven by a number of times, and it's boarded up. And I've seen conversations in town about this one particular church that's boarded up, and you see the same conversations. You see oh, what a shame. And then you see people bring up the comment, lots of these comments. Well, if they weren't expletive, CSA with children, then this wouldn't have happened. And then you see the people say, oh, you shouldn't be so disrespectful to the Catholic Church. I drive by that church and I say, and I stand by this, if you weren't doing these things, if you weren't abusing children and sweeping it under the rug and reassigning and sending these priests to this secret camp or putting them on the island for a little while to get fixed, quote unquote fixed, which they never got fixed, you wouldn't be bankrupts and losing churches. People wouldn't be running from churches. I mean, they're losing members. Membership is dwindling.
But I mean, at the same time, it's still a multi-billion-dollar organization. And again, I'm not out for the Catholic Church, believe me. Like, that's not what I'm interested in. I'm really interested in exposing the way that underrepresented, marginalized children are abused by systems, that systems allow the abuse to happen because they think that these children don't have power. But I think, children grow up and they become the adults, and we're the adults now, and it's time to take back that power and claim, our stories and tell our stories to help prevent this from happening to future generations. It's like, if people really don't want this to happen anymore, we know that it's 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 8, they say boys, although I think it's higher. Boys tend to report less, a whole bunch of other things. But if you look around a room and you're in a room and you're with more than 5 women, one of them has been sexually abused as a child. I mean, it is such an epidemic in our society that nobody talks about. And I get it. Who wants to talk about it? Right. I don't want to talk about it. But guess what? If you don't talk about it, you don't get better.
Right. And what angers me a lot about this is these priests knew that they would get away with it, because they were allowed to. The Archdiocese of Worcester, of Boston, etc., all across the country, across the world, they have shown us that they're going to let them get away with it, because they have.
Well, one of the things that really interests me about the story as well is that, in Massachusetts, unlike other places like Philadelphia, we have not had a grand jury report on all of the dioceses in Massachusetts. So we had Boston in 2003 by the Attorney General Tom Riley, when the Boston Globe story came out. They reported on the Boston Archdiocese. But again, that was 20 plus years ago. We've learned a lot more about the Boston Archdiocese since then. In addition, the other dioceses, Fall River, Worcester, and Springfield, have not had a grand jury report done on them and no investigation into what was going on. They're not responsible for reporting all of the credibly accused priests or all of the children and who came forward with allegations of abuse. So there's so much more that is not, like, if you ask Mitch Garabedian, who was, played by Stanley Tucci in the movie Spotlight, the attorney who represented a lot of these victims. I asked him once, and I have a soundbite from him where I say, do you think that the whole story has been told? And he said, we're not even at the first layer of the onion. Like, this is so much more to the story. And again, like you said, it's a lot of organizations. So for me, it's also like, DSS at the time, Department of Social Services, and DCF, today. How many of these foster kids were part of this abuse?
You touched on that, but it's huge.
That's a whole other season. Yeah. I mean, literally, it's a whole season that I hope to do at some point in terms of the foster care and what continues to happen in foster care. And, that's a system of abuse and neglect that all too often we, is covered up for so many reasons, because the kids don't have social capital, because, they're so hurt and damaged by the time they become adults that they're not allowed to do a lot of things about it, because secrecy, right? If you try to get anything from DCF or DSS, it's private. Everything's private. We can't, there's secrecy. No, these records can't be shared because of, these are juvenile personal records. It's like, well, how much abuse has not been shared as a result of that? I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot, not just in Massachusetts, it's around the country as well. And so that's just one part of the story. But, it's these systems of abuse and, law enforcement that were, you look at the Sandra Birchmore case, I mean, there are people and it's so heartbreaking. It's so heartbreaking. I look at that little girl and I can't tell you how often I look at that woman, really, when she was 23, And she still looks like a little girl to me. And I just identify with her so much. I was that freckle-faced, little light-skinned, girl that looked way younger than I was even, when I was a teenager. And that
For
so
her,
easily could have been me.
She was so energetic and interested in the program that she was involved in Stoughton. And as her abuse continued, because we need to remember, she was a child who was groomed by an adult police officer.
Yes, when they call it a sexual relationship.
They were not dating. She had it by the time she was 23 when she died, and let's call it what it is, she was murdered and they tried to cover it up. There was an arrested development that happened with a woman
100%.
like her, because she didn't have an opportunity to have quote unquote regular adolescence because of the abuses.
No. And she had been groomed for so long, and she had lost all these people that loved her, and she just wanted to be part of. And I mean, a million different things. But Laura Grimaldi of the Boston Globe did an excellent job, I think, covering this case, and I hope continues to cover this case. And one of the things that she wrote in her series that was in the Boston Globe magazine that just tore my heart out, and it really hit home for me, was that Sandra Birchmore was so excited to be the mother that she didn't have. And I identified with that so much, because when I became a mother, that was all I wanted. It was all I ever wanted, was to be the mother I didn't have. And I had the opportunity to do that. Thank God I had the opportunity to do that. And I know how that felt for her and how much she wanted that. And that just broke my heart. And, and so Sandra Birchmore is one of, 1,000 stories, if not more. And she's not here to speak for herself anymore. And people have to speak for her and for children like her, and to reveal these systemic abuses. And I think that, it's too easy for people to be like, oh, that was one bad cop. No, it was 3 bad cops and maybe more. And why is that not being looked at?
And she can't be the only student of that program at Stoughton Police Department that this was happening to.
Amen. And I think Kirk Minahan did a great, piece on one of his episodes on the Sandra Birchmore podcast, where he talked about the Police Explorer program around the country and how kids from that program have been abused regularly. And because it is another system of abuse where they have access to kids that is unquestioned, right?
It's another organization that is so completely supported by the public.
That's right.
It's hugely funded.
Right.
Law enforcement is hugely funded in every town, every county, everywhere across the U.S.
Right. But not only that, like, imagine that you are a child, teenager, whatever, young adult, being abused by somebody in authority, a teacher, a Catholic priest, a Boy Scout leader, a cop, any of those things. And you come from a dysfunctional family background. You're already experiencing potentially neglect, abuse, poverty, any number of things that are social determinants of health, right? That sort of change outcomes for people. And, that person in authority says to you, who's going to believe you?
That's right.
And it's, in your heart of hearts that is so true. Who is going to believe me? Who do I have to go to that would actually believe me? And most victims that I know that I've spoken with told people, and they didn't believe them. Or they told them to be quiet because it was, they didn't want, the attention, or they didn't want any number of things. But it's like, it's just terrible.
And that's really what happened to her. Right down to the very end, when that officer allegedly came in, murdered her, tried to make it look like she took her own life, and thought the same very thing. Who's going to believe that I did this? I'm going to set her up to look like a crazy bitch, quote unquote crazy bitch, because I had a long conversation with folks that are a part of the Sandra Birchmore movement.
Right.
Those are the things that we said, that these men, they wave the hands.
Well, not only that, because they had other systems supporting them. So you have the medical examiner's office supporting you. You have the district attorney's office supporting you. You have all these other people that aren't even questioning
and her
your
family,
word.
We're saying this. you have to look at this again.
It was the family that did this. It was the family that advocated. And this is, again, another great example of advocacy, and the family did, advocate for Sandra and for justice for Sandra, and to get an expert that they had to hire themselves to bring in to get people to take another look at this and to get publicity. And so that's some of the things that we talk about when we're talking about advocacy training with MPAC. It's like we can talk about ways to get publicity and ways to, do appeal to your legislators and share your story and, get experts if needed. And so many things that are an approach that people can do to these, for these cases and for people who don't have voices. So we're here and we're happy to help. And,
all this information that we've talked about will be available. And, when you're ready to roll out the next episode, we'll definitely be able to, spread that information and let people know that it's coming.
Thank you. And also, Anngelle, what we're going to do is we want to go out and do some events that we can talk with people.
Well, it's great that you bring that up, because I was going to say, we really want to have an in-person event to talk about this and what happens in Lawrence and what happens, and what we know about the Merrimack Valley. We want to have an in-person thing. And I really want folks from Lawrence to come and be part of this conversation.
From the Merrimack Valley, for sure. And, there are other people from Essex County and the Merrimack Valley that are part of that 27 unsolved cases that I've talked about, a number of other people. And so there are a number of cases that we can talk about as well, regarding some of, the unsolved situations, and ones that, I think potentially could be related to Andy's and why. So we'd love to have an in-person event, and that's something that we are in the works on planning. So definitely follow us on our socials and also on our websites or what have you. And, so you can be kept up to date on the information so that we can see you at these events, because we want to see you and we want to move the issues forward.
And, 2025 is going to be a big year for a couple of things. It's going to be a big year because Open Investigation season 2 is coming out. That's going to have massive impact on the region for sure. And we're working on, you've talked about MPAC a number of times, which I continue to talk about too. It's Massachusetts Missing and Murdered Persons Advocacy Coalition. It's Melanie, it's me, it's Dr. Anne-Marie Myers. We have had great folks involved, like Shana from Light the Way, which is a great advocacy missing persons organization. We have had input, consultation maybe from Julie Murray, sister of Maura Murray, who's been missing for almost 21 years. So we have people that really know about these things.
Right. And we host an annual event, and we'll be hosting more. And, we'd love for people to find out more, because, again, it's about empowering families to be able to make the systemic change and being able to feature your stories to be able to make the change. There's lots of folks out there whose cases have not been heard, and we think are really important in terms of being able to bring them forward. And we care. And in the open investigation piece, it's like, for season 2, and, I'm sure there'll be seasons after that, and we'll see what those are as we're moving forward. But, we'd love to introduce you guys as well to Dr. Anne-Marie Myers. If you don't know Dr. Anne-Marie Myers, you can Google her, but she is phenomenal. She's a forensic anthropologist with the medical examiner's office for quite some time, is now a professor at Anna Maria College, but had been instrumental in recovering a number of missing children, including Molly Bish and Sarah Pryor, Holly Peranian. She worked on the Lady of the Dunes case in the early years. She was the expert witness who recovered, physically dug out of the ground, the bodies of the infamous crime boss, Whitey Bulger. She recovered Whitey Bulger's victims and was delivered fascinating expert testimony in his trial when he was found guilty. And I've known Dr. Myers. If you watch the documentary, we met. You'll see the first day we met is on this dig. Dr. Myers and I have known each other since 1999 and became friends while searching a clandestine grave, what we were told was a clandestine grave, or believed was a clandestine grave, where Andy might have been buried. And we became friends, through that experience, and have had many, many experiences since then. And Dr. Myers' commitment to missing persons and to the cause has been just incredible. And so much of the work she does is just above and beyond what I've seen so many people do, and she is just amazing. And I think that at some point we'll have her as a guest as well. And Anngelle, it would be great to have you be part of that. And, we can all talk together and maybe just have a conversation that, even if it's a live, maybe we'll do a YouTube live. That's the other thing, is we're starting a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Woohoo.
Yeah, let's do it.
So when Anngelle and I get off the recording here, we're going to be updating my YouTube to have a YouTube channel going. So I'll definitely be hosting guests on the YouTube channel, and we'll be talking more about these stories. And again, what makes it unique in terms of the podcast and the YouTube and all of those things is that I'm an experienced investigative journalist, documentary filmmaker with lived experience as well, that is telling these stories in a fact-based way, in a documentary style, to show people the truth and to elevate the voices of the underrepresented kids and survivors.
Thank you, Melanie Perkins McLaughlin. Her podcast, Open Investigation, 9-part series available now everywhere you listen. Open Investigation Season 2 is coming. Massachusetts Missing and Murdered Persons Advocacy Coalition, MPAC, online massmissingandmurder.org. You can follow it online. We are ramping up events coming soon and going to Advocacy Con. That happens at the end of March in Indianapolis. And True Crime Podcast Festival, which happens in July in Danvers, is coming to Massachusetts this year. That's cool. Thank you for listening. Please support Crime of the Truest Kind. Follow at Crime of the Truest Kind everywhere. Everything about the show, crimeofthetruestkind.com. I continue every other week releasing on Fridays because that is what my work schedule is going to allow. And please do send me your show ideas. All of you are really great at doing that. crimeofthetruestkind@gmail.com. Melanie's show, openinvestigationpodcast.com. HaveYouSeenAndy.com. If you have not watched the documentary, Have You Seen Andy? About missing 10-year-old boy Andy Puglisi, who disappeared from Lawrence, Massachusetts, please watch it. All right, I gotta go now. Lock your goddamn doors.